Every single day, we are affected by sports, whether we want to acknowledge it or understand it at all. But the sociology of sports sociology, still untapped potential by Eckstein, Rick Moss, Dana M. Delaney, and Kevin J., talks about this very aspect of sports. Now, what is it about? It's about how sports frame our very own society on two different levels, just like normal sociology, on a micro level and on a macro level. On a micro level, small social interactions and how class within the sport can form, and I'll talk about that later. And on a macro level, economic and political scales. Now, on a micro level, and this is a quote from the article itself, micro approaches, or what Karen and Washington might call cultural lenses, focus on how sports can frame issues of gender, race, or sexuality, or how identities and ideas are socially constructed or reinforced by participating in or viewing sporting events. Generally, this approach examines the social and social psychological impact of sports activities themselves. Now, what this is talking about is how, even on its smallest level, sports affects us. Say you live in town, they say you live in downtown Cincinnati, and the Bengals are playing that night, and you want to go out. There is going to be a ton of traffic, and that affects you on a micro level. That's a personal level, an anecdotal level. Now, on a macro scale, and this is also a quote from the article, enormous amounts of economic resources are dedicated to professionally and amateur sporting enterprises. Governments spend time and resources subsidizing sports venues, underwriting grandiose sporting events such as the Olympics, and creating legal framework encouraging sports monopolies. Sports-only shows are proliferating and on radio and television. In addition, as sports sociologists have demonstrated, sports help construct ideologies of gender, affect gender relations, and support or challenge racial and social class hierarchies. Now, this isn't much talked about in the media, but it's something that happens. Now, an example I can give you is in the Olympics a couple years ago, when Donald Trump was in presidency, he threatened North Korea, and the Olympics were that year. North Korea came to the Olympics. Everybody was worried about what they were going to do, what was going to happen. Maybe there's going to be a tragedy. That affects us and North Korea on a political and economic scale. It's huge. It's a big scale, a society being affected by one singular thing. Now, why does this matter? So the sports and athletes who participate in them affect their daily lives, whether we know it or understand it. Like I said before, as a kid, you could be watching, I see in the background, it's Buster Posey as the catcher, and I know myself, I watched him when I was a kid, and I loved watching him every single game, and that affected me of who I am today. In those little moments, even if you don't even care about sports, you hear about that guy who hit 4 home runs in one game, or the guy who ran for 5 touchdowns and 400 yards in one game. You look at it and you're like, wow, he really did that? Like, that's crazy. And it affects us on a small level every single day, and we don't even know it. That's the crazy part. Now, the article also talked about how often the micro and macro level sociology was talked about in the media, and everything was talked about more except for class and politics.